Greetings and welcome to Converging Streams, Interfaith Fellowship in Our Modern World. Our program is a production of the Muncie Interfaith Fellowship. This installment, Reflections on the Spiritual Power of Nonviolence, Part 1 of 3, features excerpts from a 2013 interview on Indianapolis radio station WICR for the program JourneysFire with host Richard Brendan discussing with Reverend George Wolfe his book, The Spiritual Power of Nonviolence. Here is the first portion of that interview.
I want to start off where you started in the introduction. You started in the last days of April 1992 with all the events taking place in the state of California, because at that time you were living in Marin County, just north of San Francisco. And I'd like for you to just share what you were witnessing on the TV that so many people were doing, but what effect that had on you at that time.
Well, I guess I noticed the contrast. I had just gotten back from India, and while I was in India, I was there to study Hindustani music, but I also got very interested in Gandhi and his philosophy. And in some of the sightseeing I did, I went around to see places where Gandhi had been and his cremation site and so forth. So I had been thinking about the history of nonviolence in America, and then I was seeing on television here these two great contrasts that were unfolding in the way of calling public attention to the injustice of the Rodney King beating. And, on one end there was this tremendous violence and chaos in Los Angeles. On the other side, there was this very disciplined protest on the Bay Bridge in San Francisco, Oakland Bay Bridge. And it just struck me how when it came to news coverage, when it came to the impact, immediate impact of what was going on, that the peaceful protest, the disciplined protest that was going on the Oakland Bay Bridge received much more coverage than the what was going on in Los Angeles, simply because it was dangerous for the reporters to be there in Los Angeles. And the other thing that struck me is that prior to that, there had been this earthquake in Northern California, and the human-inflicted damage, both in terms of human life, loss of human life, and damage to property, was far greater in Los Angeles than the natural event up north in California. So I just saw that sort of paradoxical experience had a deep impression on me and clung with me. And if you could, when you reading my book, you'll see that there's a lot of emphasis or explanation which is centered around paradox in the way we need to think about activism and about peace studies, as I bring out in my book.
Yes. I've always believed that if we're going to try to find the answers, we need to be courageous enough to ask the questions. The events that you were witnessing cause you to ponder two pressing questions. The first one, how can we convince people the world over to renounce violence and use honorable nonviolent strategies to express their anger toward what they perceive as unjust? And number two, what role should religion be playing in today's world to make it possible for our children to inherit a future without war? And actually, those two questions really serve as a framework for your book, then.
That's right. That's right. And I guess you could say my book is a meditation on those two questions.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I look at the very complex issue of peace from an interfaith perspective. I think one of the problems with peace, the idea of peace, the concept of peace, is that people have a too simplistic a notion about it. They have a lot of misunderstanding about what peace is. Peace is not a static condition. Peace is a dynamic, unfolding process, and it's something that needs to be cultured, that needs to be worked at, it needs to be maintained. And peace studies and the history of nonviolence, particularly in America, and America has this very proud history of nonviolence that goes all the way back to the colonial times, which people generally forget about. that is a way to understand how activism and how peace is really a process that has to unfold. It's not just some sort of static condition that happens to appear now and then.
Well, absolutely. And when you mention the word religion, I think it's important for you to make a distinction between spirituality and religion, because for many people, religion has this dark side to it.
Yeah, well, I talk about that in the first chapter, actually. My first chapter, which is called Apocalypse Does Not Mean War. I talk about the difference between spirituality and religion, and how really nonviolence helps to get us to the heart of what spirituality is, because it involves invoking within us patience and love and compassion, and it also involves the reflective process of not acting on our anger, but rather allowing that negative energy which generates anger within us to be given time for it to transform itself into a positive energy. And Mahatma Gandhi called this process tapasya, and it's very much like meditation. In fact, it is a form of meditation. When you're in a state of conflict and you're gripped by anger, that's the time when you don't want to act, because oftentimes when you act, you'll make the conflict worse. You'll make mistakes. You'll have to apologize and so forth. You see that happening a lot. We see that happening a lot to politicians, actually.
Oh yes.
But most people have been in a conflict, and they've acted on their anger. They realize that it was not the constructive thing to do, and actually inflamed the conflict rather than helped it. But if we just give time and reflect on the anger, now, Gandhi, it's important. Gandhi didn't mean that we repress anger. He didn't mean that we deny it. He meant actually that we reflect on it and think deeply about it and give time for that negative energy, which is really, really a good energy. It's a negative energy, but it will transform itself into a positive direction. And that's the process of tapasya, allowing that to happen. And the result of that will be an epiphany which will bring to mind constructive ways of dealing with the conflict, so that actually both sides will see the advantage of the solution.
I remember years ago when I stumbled upon the fact that the Golden Rule, which I was taught, and even as a minister in my past, teaching, was actually found in various variations in all the sacred literature and all the religions.
Yeah, that's right. And I again, in the introduction, I have this section called The Good Samaritan as Activist. And I look at the Good Samaritan from a perspective of peace activism, and how the Samaritans and the Jewish community in Jerusalem were really had quite a hostile relationship between one another, and that Jesus also had taken the Golden Rule and reformed it and placed it in the positive, expressed it in the positive. In many traditions, it's expressed in the negative.
Yes.
It says, do not do to others what you would not have them do unto you. Or as Rabbi Hillel expressed it, what is hateful to yourself, do not do to others. This is the whole Torah. And Jesus took that and in a parallel way stated Rabbi Hillel's version of the Golden Rule, but put it in the positive. And that seems to connect well with the Good Samaritan, because the Good Samaritan actually, he acted. He didn't refrain from acting, or he didn't do not do. He acted. And I think Jesus was also saying this is one way to start reconciliation. This is one way to heal this conflict between the Jews in the Jerusalem community and the Samaritans, which really were involved in a schism. And it was kind of a silly schism. I mean, they were arguing about which mountain you should worship on and so forth. And when Jesus met the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman at the well, and had that dialogue with her, which, if you remember, it's in the Gospel of John.
Yes.
She says to him, you say, she recognizes that he's a Jew from Jerusalem, and she says to him, you say we should worship in Jerusalem, but we worship here, which is on Mount Gerizim rather than on Mount Zion. And then Jesus replies, the day is coming when you won't be worshiping in Jerusalem or here. The day is coming when, and now is when, the true worshipers of God worship him in spirit and in truth. And basically he was saying, this is kind of a silly thing to argue about geographical location of where you should worship. I think he was that in conjunction with the Good Samaritan parable is really trying to show a means through which reconciliation between these groups can really start to take place.
You alluded to the first chapter, which is called Apocalypse Does Not Mean War. And I tell you, what I've certainly learned, and probably many of our listeners, that there is a danger in holding on to our dogma, and I would even add into our old school dualistic way of thinking, the good versus evil and light versus darkness.
Right, that's exactly right, and I think a lot of it comes from a misinterpretation of ancient scripture and of passages in the Bible which use terms, ancient terms that the meaning of which has kind of changed over time. Mm-hmm. Take, for example, the word apocalypse. It comes from the Greek word apokalyptine, which actually means uncovering, as if to remove a veil. The association of calamity and war and so forth with apocalypse is something which is not inherent to the word. And I began to look at this and realize that the association of fire and lightning and earthquakes and so forth with apocalypse, those are really meant to be metaphors. Fire was an ancient metaphor for transformation. If you are familiar with the 5 elements of the ancient world, mm-hmm. were earth, water, fire, air, and space. The fire is the transforming element. If you subject something to fire, it changes its form. And if you'll note that most in many of the religious traditions, fire is associated with spirit. It's the spiritual fire which transforms a person within, and that's why you had the tongues of fire descending on the apostles at the apocalypse. Descending on the apostles at Pentecost. And in the book of Malachi, it talks about the Messiah will purify the sons of Levi like a refiner's fire. Mm-hmm. And Moses saw the burning bush. You see, these are metaphors for spiritual transformation from within. And the same thing is true with, the word veil, for example, is used in the book of Isaiah, where the prophet says, and the Lord will destroy on this mountain the covering that's cast over all peoples, the veil that is spread over all nations. Paul uses the veil metaphor. The Hindus talk about the veil of Maya, which has to be lifted in order for our ignorance to be destroyed. Apocalypse really is more accurate to say it's referring more to a paradigm shift in the way we perceive reality and the way we perceive the universe and the way we perceive our relationship to the universe, yes. And in the way we perceive our relationship to the environment and how important it is now. We see this shift from mm-hmm. exploitation to sustainability. Mm-hmm. These are all paradigm shifts, which is really what the word apocalypse is getting at.
Thank you for listening to Converging Streams, Interfaith Fellowship in Our Modern World. Our program is a production of the Muncie Interfaith Fellowship and is supported by our community. We thank you, our listeners and followers, for your support. To connect with Converging Streams, including listening to our entire catalog of past programs, getting our latest new content, and making your own contribution to this program, visit our website, convergingstreams.org. Converging Streams is produced by Tony Piazza and George Wolfe. Thank you for listening and have a pleasant week.